Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LCK Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. It's finally time to get back to some LCK action, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about when it comes to the LCK, a region that has perennially been on top for the past couple of years. That's really not been contested at a lot of these major international tournaments since 2023. You are now sitting in a spot where the LCK not only didn't win the first big international tournament of the year, but didn't even make the finals of First Stand, and there is a big conversation surrounding the region because of that. There weren't really a lot of changes, but there's certainly a lot of fun things to talk about when it comes to this league and with a lot of the teams, and so I'm very excited. I know you guys are as well, so if you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What do you expect from a lot of these teams? What do you like or dislike about this video in terms of the rankings that I'm going to be putting out? You guys know the format of this by now. I've done so many of these primers on this channel that you're probably pretty familiar with them, but if not, obviously we'll go over what they are in just a second, but I'm always curious to know what you guys agree with, what you guys disagree with. This is inherently, obviously, such an opinionated video. I'm always curious to know where you guys are kind of on my wavelength and where my opinions are definitely against the grain. I'm not afraid to go against the grain, as you guys know from the past couple of years, but very curious to know that. There is a bit of a caveat. There are multiple caveats as I explain this video, but we are going to be ranking every team and every player in their position as per usual. I'm not going to try and overreact to the first split, and I know that that's not exactly what people want to hear all the time, but I am always an advocate for taking an entire snapshot over just like a small, period of time. I think that oftentimes we can get in the weeds about early season performances and just players either over or underperforming career norms in terms of how they ended up, going about that. I am not a very reactionary analyst. There are a lot of analysts out there that are going to be a bit more reactionary in terms of their expectation, that are going to sit there and say that because somebody did well or because an individual team did well, either at the top or the middle of the standings, that means they're definitely going to do well again moving forward. I think there's a lot of valuable data from what we got out of the LCK Cup, but I also think that there are some things that don't feel like they're particularly sustainable, both for good and for bad, for a lot of teams in the LCK right now. And I'm going to be talking about that, but overall, I think it's, fair to establish that specifically for the LCK, because I think even more so for other regions, we just have so much data on so many of these players, and I want to try and say that, just 1 or 2 months of gameplay is not necessarily going to prove to me that a player has either figured it out entirely or completely fallen off, all of that kind of stuff. So if you see something in here that feels like it doesn't necessarily work with the LCK Cup results, that's mostly because I believe that, you go last year's LCK Cup, not everything there was sustainable throughout the rest of the year as well. Gen.G was, an average team for a lot of the LCK Cup. They barely made their way through Nongshim and then turned into the best team in the world for the rest of the year. And then obviously you had, multiple other teams, Hanwha Life, who never really found that form again, especially after the spring split. So it just happens, right? Like, it's naturally how it goes here in League of Legends and specifically in the LCK. But the format of today's video, for those of you who might be new to the primer kind of analysis, first off, this video is going to be pretty long. Consider this a podcast style format with a couple of nice graphics up on your screen, but mostly what we're going to be doing is going from number 10 to number 1 in my personal power rankings, talking about every single team, ranking every single player within their position, and talking about where I think they're going to land, both their floor and their ceiling. Most of the time, I'm going to be able to group these teams into tiers, and that means that the individual placements are less, strict and rigid, more so just kind of guidelines. Like, a lot of teams are going to be able to move 1 or 2 spots up or down. Same thing, and especially same thing for the players, where a lot of these players, if you're ranked like the number 7, jungler or something like that, you can probably be the number 5 jungler, you can probably be the number 9 jungler. It's really not supposed to be this super rigid grading scale. People get so upset and rage bait themselves in my comment section all the time because they look at a player and they're like, how is this player at number 3 when they should be at number 2? I implore you to not take it that seriously. If you want to take it that seriously, great. Go ahead and get mad at my videos. It helps the algorithm when you leave comments like that, but they're certainly not intended to be that strict and that rigid in terms of the way that I'm constructing this. I always think there is some room or margin for error, I guess, either up or down, and you would hope that some players overperform some of their rankings as well, but we'll be going over the team and player rankings, playstyle expectations, ceilings, floors, all of that stuff as we go throughout the entire league. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. I know we're 4.5 minutes in already. Like I said, this is going to be a long one, as the primers always are. And that means starting off with number 10 in my power rankings. And this is a team that's in their own tier. I have this as the D tier at the bottom of the LCK. It's just so clearly the worst team in the league in terms of where they are sitting. It's really hard to imagine that their projected outcome is going to be higher than number 10. I do think they are significantly worse than everybody else for me. team, it's going to be HANJIN BRION. I just see this as clearly the worst team in the LCK right now, not only with what we saw in the LCK Cup, but I think specifically with what we saw, I guess, from a lot of these players. I'll just say that throughout a lot of the LCK Cup and even last year as well. It feels like even the players that were playing well in other stops don't really seem to have a lot going for them. They seem to have regressed, and that's just naturally what happens on this BRION team. It just feels like every single year, the players that are playing for them get worse. It does look like they are the only team in the LCK to be making any roster changes. Now, it's very possible they don't make any roster changes in the mid lane, which we will talk about, but they did bring a player in, and so I'm going to talk about him because I think he's more interesting than the player they already had. To quickly go over what you're seeing on the screen, team name at the top, HANJIN BRION. The number next to it, in this case, the number 10 is going to be where I personally power rank them, from number 10 to number 1 in parentheses, both for the team and for the player rankings at the bottom. That's going to be how they have changed from the LCK Cup primer to now. So I did the same exact video before the start of the year, kind of giving my preseason predictions. You know, in the parentheses, you can see how my opinion has changed on the position group in general. You can see their finish in the LCK Cup right below that. Of course, HANJIN BRION technically finishing in 8th after going winless in the regular season, just because of the way that group stage ended up working out. But of course, you have every single player as well, all 5 of their starting roster listed below that with their player rankings in their own individual positions. The big caveat I always have to give, and I know it's one more caveat, is just not every position is created equal. I feel like I say this all the time and people still get mad at me in the comment section, like, how can X person be the 6th best jungler when you say they're better than the 5th best support? Sometimes some positions are better than others. Like, that's just the way that it goes. Not every position is going to be created equally. Specifically here in the LCK, it's basically impossible to break through into the top 5 mid laners unless you're like truly transcendent and you've like figured it out and become one of the best mid laners in the world. Like, it's a gate, right? Like, you can be a really good mid laner and just come in at number 6 because mid lane's really good. Same thing for AD carry for the most part, especially now that a couple of other players have started to emerge. So, you know, generally try not to take these rankings too seriously. I put them in the video just for more visual clarity, not so much to be kind of the centralizing focus. Again, I know some people like to rage bait themselves and get super upset down in the comments. Please feel free to do so. If you really want to, it really helps the algorithm. So let's go ahead and talk about HANJIN BRION and what we are looking at for their lineup, or at least my projected version of their lineup going into spring. It looks like Casting in the top lane, Gideon in the jungle, Loki, I believe, in the mid lane, Teddy at AD carry, and Namgung at support. I have Loki listed here right now on Leaguepedia. He's still listed as the sub, but quite frankly, I think he's better than Roamer. I think that was proven in North America when Roamer, you know, had to go down to the LTA South to get some action, and of course, Loki was starting for Cloud9 last year. Roamer was never really able to make his way into Tier 1 over in NA, and generally, I thought Loki was really good in NA, whereas Roamer really struggled in split number 1, so I'm going to talk about Loki because I think he's more interesting than Roamer is right now. We'll mention both and just generally their impact, but if Loki is the better player and he's still my worst mid laner in the LCK, that is a bit of a problem for HANJIN BRION, and I think it just kind of goes to what this team was in the first split. Again, people are going to look at that 8th place finish and generally them, you know, performing better than expected, we'll just say, in terms of the way that they played in the playoffs. Seeing as how they were able to take a game off of a team that did eventually actually make the playoffs in DRX, and, you know, a team that, you know, had a lot of hype going for them. But this BRION team was so terrible throughout a majority of the regular season. I think that is much more honest towards who they actually are, and I think their problems were very clear. Their strengths are limited. Even some of the players that I like on this team, I think, have major, like, risks and major question marks in terms of what their floors actually look like. The main ones being Casting on the top side, who falls all the way down to my number 10 top laner. Not so much Casting's fault, rather I think top lane was pretty good for the most part in the LCK, in the winter split, in the LCK Cup, and I think that there were a lot of players that I just felt more comfortable moving up that were below him in the rankings at the beginning of the year. I don't think he necessarily showed anything different than what we expected, but he's not really going to have a lot of opportunity to carry on this team in the way that he would want. He is much more aggressive, much more strong side minded as a top laner. We've talked about that a lot in terms of KT Rolster and the analysis around their challengers team in general, that Casting was more of a main character down in Tier 2. And generally, I thought he was going to struggle coming up to Tier 1 because he wasn't going to get nearly as many resources. I'm not going to say that that's happened. He's been fine enough in the laning phase. He's a little below average in terms of laning for top laners right now, but he's not somebody that I think is absolutely getting taken advantage of or anything like that. Again, I just think that you either have to be a really good laner or a really good team fighter right now in the top lane. In terms of the LCK talent, it feels like everybody is kind of specialized in one direction or the other in terms of the way that they played, and I don't think Casting is necessarily dominated in either phase of the game. He's definitely a better laner than he is a team fighter, but he's a good team fighter. Once he gets on these aggressive backline accessors, like those champions are really good for him. I just don't think this team wants to draft around him in that kind of way, and that means that he's probably not going to be super productive across this year. Again, bad team top laner is kind of a hard role to fill if you are a young player. Like, it's not really a conducive avenue to be able to grow. Top lane is already a role that's naturally receiving less resources in terms of the way the game is developed, and I don't think casting has really shown anything to kind of force the hand of BRION for him to be the main character of this team. Other player that I'm actually fine with is Teddy here. I really haven't changed my opinion on Teddy. I'm still lower on Teddy than I think general consensus. A lot of people still view him as like a really valuable AD carry. I haven't, in like the entire time this channel has been running, to be entirely frank. I think he's always been a fine enough player, but he's like the definition of a good AD carry that will do exactly his job and nothing more. The example I always gave for a player like Teddy was someone like Patrick, but I think more accurately in like the modern game, someone like Sven, I think is a relatively fair comparison over in the West for Teddy on who he is. He's a good laner. He's not really going to get super far behind, but he doesn't really press his advantages. There are a lot of AD carries that will take strong side and turn a 20 CS lead into a 40 CS lead. He will be really content going neutral or getting just like a 10 or a 15 CS lead and trying to get into the late game. He's not very aggressive in terms of his positioning. He's quite passive, in fact, maybe the most passive AD carry in terms of his positioning in team fights in the entire league, and that leads to situations where he kind of needs his team to set him up, but if he can just play front to back and really safe and really standard, he's going to be just fine in terms of his ability to play out the team fights. He doesn't really make mistakes, but he also doesn't really make splash plays. Like, he doesn't win games for his team. He's just kind of a product of whatever the rest of the team is going to do, and unfortunately, when you're on a bad team, that means you're probably not going to win a lot of games. His KDAs will continue to be really solid, but he's just fine. He's a solid, lower half AD carry in the LCK, but not somebody that's going to be the best player on a team and actually carry them to wins. It's what he's been the past couple of years, and unfortunately, he might be the most talented player on this team, which is never a great spot for a player of that skill set. I think I was really excited about Gideon coming in here in the jungle. He was bad in split number 1. He's dropping all the way down to number 9. Like, this is one of the reactionary takes that I think I'm comfortable going towards, because I think situation-wise, it was just a nightmare for Gideon. He was a player that really impressed me last year, and quite frankly, I was already kind of on the Gideon train. It felt like he was one of those players that I talk about a lot, just like the bell curve is going up, right? Where it's just he gets better and better and better every single split and every single time you watch him. That kind of felt like the trajectory his career was on. He was okay on Invictus when he was in the LPL. He comes over here to Bro and actually does a really good job for this team before getting replaced for basically no reason. Goes to Nongshim and is awesome for the beginning part of last year, like a borderline all-pro caliber jungler for, the beginning part of last year. Nongshim obviously completely falls apart by the end of the year, having to play in the Legend group, and Gideon is a part of that. He ends up underperforming quite a bit, but I'm not going to blame him entirely for having to go up against the 4 teams that ended up representing the LCK at Worlds game after game after game and not being good enough there. I thought that in a better situation here for BRION, in the fact that he's going to be playing lower tier teams at the very least every so often, I thought he was actually going to kind of get back to his form and be a pretty solid jungler. That was not the case. As an aggressive facilitator, somebody kind of built in that Tarzan mold, he was giving over resources basically entirely for free. The early games were significantly worse, and I think he was getting caught out in the late game a lot more commonly. Now, part of that is that he had by far the weakest mid laner in the entire league, one of the weakest players in the entire league in Roamer, but generally, you have to at least give him some responsibility for the way that those games ended up getting kind of boiled out of control, quite frankly, in terms of tempo, and I'm not super sure that this is a great environment for him to be able to get back onto his feet. So as much as I do like Gideon, and I still think he has quite a bit of upside, I have to, try and play into what he was in the winter split, which was not a very good player. Then you get to talk about Namgung. Again, we'll get to Loki last. Namgung was not good, and that was more expected. I think we all kind of looked at the Challengers League tape and went, okay, like, you're going to have to overperform what you were in tier 2 in order to be a good tier 1 player, and he was bad. Like, he was probably the worst support in the league, almost certainly the worst support in the league. Ghost and Polu were also pretty bad for KT Rolster, but Namgung might have been even worse in terms of the production. The problem is that when you look at the tier 2 tape and why people were excited about him, that Gen.G Challengers team or Gen.G Academy team ended up putting so many resources into their AD carry, who's now over in the LPL, that basically everybody on the team was just forced into being super specific in terms of the role they operated under. Namgung only played for the 2v2 in lane. He did basically nothing else throughout any of his time in tier 2, and that made it really hard to evaluate him, and quite frankly, it made me scared in terms of what his skill set was as a player heading up to tier 1, and that's exactly what happened. He was an okay, like a mediocre laner, and he could do nothing else at a tier 1 caliber level. That is going to have to improve. Still a young player. It's only been 1 split. I'm not giving up on him, but it was not a good start, and I think he's going to have to prove that he belongs here in the LCK after what I would consider to be, pretty bad tape in the LCK Cup. And then Loki in the mid lane, or Roamer. Again, if Roamer's still here, the conversation is very different. Roamer was by far the worst mid laner in the entire league in the winter split, and I think it's reasonable to expect him to stay that way because his laning was really bad and his team fighting decisions were really bad. He just looked very outclassed at this tier 1 level, and I think it's clear that maybe he just doesn't have the mechanics to be able to function in the LCK as a mid laner. Like, the bar is so incredibly high for that position that you need to be able to, at the very least, like, hold your own, and he just wasn't really able to do that. Loki, I think, gives you much more upside, mostly because I think Loki is a lot more versatile than he gets credit for. He was brought into Cloud9 last year to be a facilitator for Blabber because that's what he was in the Challengers League, but as the year went on, they kind of realized, okay, Blabber's going to be better as the facilitator and Loki is going to need to carry, and he was really good in that role in North America. I thought he was really underrated as a primary option and actually won a lot of games for that team down the stretch of the year when they were really good in the regular season, which people forget because they completely collapsed in the playoffs. They were the #1 seed going into the playoffs last year, and Loki, to me, was a big part of that in terms of their regular season performance and dominance. And overall, I'm still really excited about what he could potentially be, but it is a risk. Like, this guy was available for a reason. We knew he wanted to go back to Korea at the start of the year. If he is going to be starting here, he needs to be able to take both parts of his skill set and combine them into one. He was a good facilitator, but Gideon is probably going to need to be a bit more aggressive in terms of the way that he plays the jungle if Loki is going to be that role. Now, if Loki's going to be more of a carry, then Gideon can start getting back on some of these tanks and these facilitators, but that's also not really the meta right now in terms of how things are breaking down. So, as much as I like Loki and think he could be okay here, it's certainly not guaranteed, and I don't think he's that much better than Roamer. And Roamer might also just be here, who's very clearly the #10 mid laner. And, you know, it's just one of those situations where it feels like BRION, while they're trying to make progress, they just don't necessarily have the pieces on this team to make immediate progress. I like casting. I think there's a chance that he could break out as a really good top laner. You're hopeful that Gideon can get back into a good spot in the jungle, but I think those two players in particular are the two that you're really relying on. And quite frankly, neither of them showed anything at the beginning of the year to justify this team being anywhere above #10, kind of in their own tier at the bottom of the LCK. Then moving on to #9 in my personal power rankings, and this is the start of my C tier. D tier was kind of by themselves with okay bro, not okay, HANJIN bro, down on the bottom of this power ranking, but 9 to, you guessed it, #6 in these power rankings. They're all going to be within the same tier, and that means that really within this cluster, I can imagine any of them being a top 6 team and making the playoffs, and I can also imagine any of them being a bottom 2 team and not performing particularly well. That's how close I think the teams towards the middle of the standings here in the LCK are. I don't think any of them separated themselves at the beginning of the year, but coming in at #9 for me, it's going to be NS RedForce in terms of, you know, just confidence. I don't really feel as good about them as I do the other teams in terms of how they performed at the beginning of the year. Even if they have quite a bit of talent on this team, it doesn't feel like they're going to be able to get the most out of it because, once again, they're just such a limited roster in terms of where their talent is located. And I think that there were some players that stepped up in a lot of the roles that they were relying on to be, you know, top tier at, most notably in the mid lane, where I think they kind of needed Scout to be the best of the rest mid laner. He's been good at the beginning of the year, but inconsistent, and I think generally there were just other mid laners that I felt better about coming out of, you know, split #1 out of the LCK Cup, and, you know, it just felt like this team never really had their foothold in. Again, coming in 7th in the LCK Cup, a team that really underperformed, expected themselves to make playoffs, and couldn't get the job done. So, let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Kingin in the top lane, Sponge in the jungle, Scout in the mid lane, Taeyun 80 carry, and Lehens at support. Of course, it's a pretty easy conversation in terms of where the strengths and weaknesses are. I'm still really in on Kingin. I don't think we saw anything in the LCK Cup to dissuade me from calling him a top 4 top laner. I think a lot of people are going to put other players on better teams ahead of him. You know, players like Clear and Shiwu that were obviously on really successful teams, and spoiler alert, are not higher than Kingin in my top lane rankings. I think those players are fine. They're solid enough, but Kingin, I think individually, if you isolate his performances, is still a player that I would prefer in a lot of those spots. I think he gives you a lot more flexibility in terms of the way he can play the game, and I think generally he's still the biggest asset that NS has in terms of the way that they want to operate, because he can be both strong and weak side, which I definitely can't say a lot of other top laners can do in the league right now. It feels like, again, I talked about this a bit when we talked about casting, but there are a lot of really specialized skill sets in top lane, either very pro lane or very pro team fight, and it doesn't feel like Kingin is bad in either. Casting, another player that we talked about being versatile, but the difference there is that Kingin is just much better than casting in terms of playing the 1v1 and generating his own leads if he is going to play strong side, and I think he's a much more consistent team fighter. He's one of the best team fighting top laners in the entire league. I think his laning, though, has really gotten better. He's almost almost underrated in that phase of the game now because he's almost always in a spot where he's not necessarily comfortable in the lane matchup that he's in, not because he's a bad player, but because he's constantly getting counterpicked with this team and the way that they want to draft. But overall, Kingen can just kind of be left on an island. He'll do fine for himself. He's very talented. He can also be played for, and he'll be fine in that role as well. They're very happy to have him on the top side. Nothing in split number 1 kind of dissuaded that opinion from me. You still have Lehens in the support position. I'm getting less and less excited about Lehens being the face of this team in terms of the way that they operate because he's very Mickey X-esque, and I obviously have made a lot of comparisons between Nongshim and SK over the beginning part of this year because SK basically did their own Nongshim thing where they got one good player on the top side and then, you know, built around a support with no other ancillary pieces that were actually proven or good really in any way, and Lehens obviously has kind of fallen into that position, but Lehens being so aggressive and constantly putting his team into spots where they have to kind of pick up for him in the mid game, it's really hard to play around. If you don't have great talent around you, that can get punished really heavily. We saw him last year on Nongshim actually have a ton of success in that vein because his jungler was a lot better than people expected him to be. Gideon was actually a very pleasant surprise, and he could actually go really deep in terms of his vision coverage in the mid game, you know, be able to create a lot of these flank angles for the two of them to be able to play out in terms of the roams and make that work in a way that a lot of teams weren't expecting, especially at the beginning of the year. The problem is his jungler is significantly worse right now in Sponge than Gideon was last year, and he doesn't have that tempo. Taeyun is not a good laner, and we'll talk about him in just a second, and Lehens is struggling because of it. He's in a spot where it's just going to be difficult for him to be able to play his style. This is the thing that we saw, you know, kind of cause him problems on a lot of the mid-table teams throughout the beginning part of his career, when he left Griffin, when he was going to Afrika, when he was playing on a lot of those teams where he was just fine as a support, really greedy and aggressive and feast or famine. Like, that version of Lehens is basically what we have now because he doesn't have the teammates to back up his playstyle. So he's going to continue to fall down. He goes down -1 here to number 5. Again, another support just kind of leapfrogs him. You can probably guess who, but I still think Lehens is valuable in isolation. I just don't know how valuable he is specifically to this team right now because, again, the middle 3 on this team are all major concerns. Scout, I still feel fine about. I don't think Scout was bad. I just think there were other mid laners that were better in split number 1, and they're not all that different in terms of my preconceived notions, and so Scout falls to number 8. He was really bad last year. I think he had some nice moments in the winter split in the LCK Cup where he was able to generate his own leads. He wasn't making nearly as many mistakes in the mid game. It felt like the communication was better between him and a lot of his teammates, which is obviously cool. It's cool to see him in the LCK. I just don't think he's a game wrecker. There were a lot of times in the playoffs where they needed him to step up, and he wasn't really able to do that. And if you want to kind of compound that, I mean, you're talking about a jungle AD carry duo who definitely were not able to step up in the playoffs. Scout has even more responsibility in that role because Kingen, as much as we want him to be a primary option, like he's a top laner, it's the least important role in the game right now. Lehens is super greedy and aggressive and kind of relies on mid-tempo in order to make a lot of the plays that he wants. Scout actually has a ton of responsibility on this team with the way that he operates and the way that he needs to win in the early game, and I just don't think that that is a good spot for a player like Scout who would prefer the game to go a lot slower. He's always been a player who's preferred to be more of a team fighter. The player I have always compared Scout to, or I guess the player I've always compared to Scout, is Quad over in the LCS, and obviously formerly here in the LCK, where he's a player who can win in lane, who has the mechanics to be able to keep up, but in an ideal scenario, he's going to be able to generate his own resources in the 1v1 by going up just like 10 or 20 CS, not really shoving and roaming a lot, getting to the late game and being able to team fight at a really efficient level. That's the ideal scenario for Scout. He can't do that on this team. He has to be much more aggressive in the early game if this team wants to find any level of success, and I just think that that's not necessarily what you want out of Scout at this stage of his career. We can talk about Taeyun here. I kind of skipped over him when we talked about the bot lane. I'm just not in on Taeyun. I know that there were some performances that would give you hope, but also there were a ton that basically confirmed everything we thought about this guy. He's not the worst AD carry in the universe like he was the first time he played in the LCK and was just really bad for Kwangdong, but he is not an asset. He's not valuable to this team. He can do his job if he's put in a scenario where he can team fight, and if he's not basically given free resources, he's not going to generate them on his own. He's not a good laner. He can be an okay mid-game skirmisher if he's neutral, but it's hard to get him there neutrally because Lehens doesn't want to play for the 2v2. It's not something that this team has necessarily gone towards. Lehens likes to be much more of a macro threat than someone who just sits in lane and tries to get his AD carry into a good spot. I like that for this team, but it certainly hurts Taeyun's like individual production because his mid-game skirmishing is not nearly as consistent now, and he's only good as a late-game team fighter when he gets to play super aggro and kind of have these big pop-off moments, and if he's not in that spot, he's very inconsistent in the way he plays 5v5s at the end of games in terms of his positioning and just generally where he wants to put his aggression. He'll get caught out more than any other AD carry in the later part of the game. even if you'll also have a couple of moments where he pops off and has a couple of pentakills. He's just a very feast or famine late game player, and tacking that on to being a bad laner and a mid game skirmisher who's not going to get played for in the mid game, like, he's just not a valuable piece here on Nongshim, and that's kind of what we saw in split number 1. I think that there was an opportunity in a world for him to be better than what he was, and again, there were times in split 1 where I thought he was okay. I just generally don't expect that to be consistent for him at all. And then there's Sponge, who is very clearly the worst jungler in the league. I mean, this guy just doesn't really have it. Like, he is an okay facilitator, and I think outside of that, he can't really do anything at a tier 1 level. He's not a good tempo player. Even when he does generate an advantage for himself, he oftentimes takes his foot off the gas way too much in order to punish it and allows teams to get back into games. He's not really somebody who is all that elite of a skirmisher. He's an okay late game team fighter. I would say that's his biggest strength, but getting there has been a massive problem for him. He just is not valuable. And again, when you're talking about a team with Lehens, who wants to play fast and aggressive and is going to try and make things feast or famine on the bottom side, because if you're not playing with him, he's just going to kill himself over and over again. You have one of the slowest, if not the slowest, mid-jungle duos in the entire league with Sponge and Scout, neither of whom feel comfortable playing fast because they just don't, play well in a lot of the mid-game skirmishes around objectives, which is the most important part of the game. I'm not out on Nongshim. I think this team can get top 6. I put them 6th in my preseason power rankings for a reason, but I think that there are clear playstyle problems, and you have to hope for a breakout from either Sponge, Scout, or Taeyun. Likely 2 of those 3 players need to be like top 6 or 7 players in their roles just to have this team be anywhere near a playoff contention, and that's just kind of a hard sell. This team likely needed to make it when the league was at its weakest in the winter split. They still couldn't do that. They still couldn't make top 6 when teams like DRX and, the DN SOOPers, who we haven't even yet talked about on this list, were making playoffs, and if they can't do it then, it's hard to sell me on the fact that they're going to get better throughout the rest of the year. Then moving on to number 8 in my power rankings, and this is a team that did really well for themselves in the previous split, but I just don't know how sustainable it's going to be. It's Kiwoom DRX coming in at number 8 for me, kind of having a bit of a name change here, technically going to, I guess, Kiwoom DRX. I believe their tag is changing as well to KRX. I don't know, man. I don't know what's going on here. DRX feels like a pretty, historic brand considering they won the 2022 World Championships, but that's what we said about Damwon before they changed to Dplus KIA. Still kind of hate that change, but hopefully, DRX can continue to be a team that has a good brand under them, because that's kind of what's carrying them right now in terms of a lot of fan support and in terms of a lot of expectation. They overperform quite a bit in the LCK Cup, get themselves into the playoffs pretty unexpectedly, perform as expected once they get to the playoffs. They're a team that I think some people thought, me included, that they could have gotten top 5. I think 6th was a lot more accurate towards what they actually were in terms of skill set, and I think they might even have some regression. This is me not overreacting to LCK Cup and saying that this team still has quite a few problems that they kind of got exposed on in the playoffs. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Rich in the top lane, Willer in the jungle, Yukal in the mid lane, Jiwoo at AD carry, and Ondel at support. I feel kind of bad for some of these rankings because some of them feel very disingenuous with the way that this team played at their absolute best. It's just really hard for me to say that some of these players are absolutely better than the contemporaries that they would need to be above in order for me to rank them as such. Like, this is one of those situations where does Rich really feel correct as the 9th best top laner? No. Like, he's probably around the same level as what someone like Shiwoo is, and Shiwoo's much higher on this list, but like, who do I put him above? Like, there are other top laners that I think performed better than Rich and were also very good throughout a lot of the split. Players like Dudu that kind of raised above him, players like Perfect that I think obviously showed a lot over the course of last year. It's just really hard for me to sit here and say that Rich is like definitely better than those guys, and that means that he falls at number 9. I don't really want him there. He's a very specific player in the way that he plays, but he was really valuable to DRX over the beginning part of this year. He is a very solid team fighter, one of the better and more consistent team fighting top laners in the entire league, if we're being honest. The biggest flaw for Rich as a player has always been his laning, which has been disastrous if he's not protected in the draft phase, but that's even something that he's worked on and started to get better at. He's not a good laner. He's still definitely below average, and, he's not even really close to being average in terms of being a laner, but him not being like the most gigantic of liabilities in the 1v1 on the top side is already an improvement over what he was for a long time, both in the LCK and in the LPL. And that's turned him into a player that actually does have quite a bit of value on this DRX team. It adds quite a lot of value to this team because you can, for the most part, just expect the same thing game after game out of Rich on the top side. If top was a more important role, I think he would actually be boosting this team up quite a bit. Don't take that number 9 to be too serious in terms of the ranking. Again, that's one of those numbers that I wish I could change. I really do. I like Rich, and I think he's playing better now than he did last year, which was already a pretty good year for him. I just don't think there's a top laner that I feel comfortable putting him above, and it's just one of those situations. Yeah, unfortunately, know, the same thing with casting, where it's like, I don't want casting at number 10. Top lane's just kind of deep right now. And I think you could say similar things about other players on this team as well. I'm actually going to jump around a bit and go to the bot lane next, because Ondel is the second player that I really would like to speak about on this team. Ondel had an awesome winter split, and if he's going to play like he did in the LCK Cup, this team is probably going to be better than 8th in terms of their rankings. They probably are going to be closer to 6th now. Like I said, because they're in the C tier, that means theoretically they could get 6th, then their grade wouldn't really change at all. Like, again, the difference in grades between number 6 and number 9 in these rankings is completely negligible. But, you know, Ondel is probably the key to unlocking the higher end of that outcome for DRX in terms of their, you know, performances. He was genuinely one of the better supports, I would say, throughout a lot of the LCK Cup. He was making a lot of plays. He was really solid in the 2v2. I think he fits this meta well because he is an enchanter player and is more comfortable playing the 2v2 than a lot of other supports. My biggest problem with Ondel, and the reason I'm not committing to him being like the 6th best support in the league or something like that, is because we've seen this before. I've seen this tale happen in previous years with Ondel specifically as a player. This guy's career trajectory is actually really simple to talk about. At the beginning of every year that he plays, he's really good and he shows a lot of promise and he feels really comfortable. And as the year continues to go along, he just gets worse and worse and worse. It's happened every single year of his entire career. And so I don't want to sit here and say that that's going to happen again. I am still, you know, giving him some acknowledgement for the way that he played. He's going from number 10 to number 8 in terms of my support rankings. He's definitely moving up in those rankings, but I don't want to sit here and say that he's just going to be exactly what he was in the LCK Cup, because it's hard to imagine that, you know, with the way that he has performed throughout his career, that that's just going to be the case. Again, there are some encouraging traits. The fact that the meta, I think, is very favorable for him. The fact that I do think that he has good chemistry and good synergy with Jiwoo, which we're going to talk about a bit moving forward. Like, those are all big positives, but I just need to see it over the course of something that isn't just one tournament for me to fully believe it. If he is good throughout all of spring and we're going into summer with him, like, actively having been a top half support again, yeah, he's going to move up and he's going to be pretty high in these rankings. And I think if you are looking at DRX as a playoff team, it's probably because you have more faith in the bot lane than I do. But right now I'm taking a wait and see approach on Ondel, and I'm also kind of taking a wait and see approach on Jiwoo. He was fine. He was actually pretty bad throughout a lot of the regular season, which I don't think he got credit for, but he stepped up when this team needed to make the playoffs, which I think was a really important factor for them. I just don't know what to expect out of Jiwoo. And once again, you're looking at a league where if you have any uncertainty in terms of what you're going to be, you're probably going to be near the bottom of a lot of these rankings because players are really good in the LCK. It's a very deep league for a reason. I think Jiwoo has the potential to be a top 6 or so, a top half-ish AD carry in the LCK, or at least like somewhere around average. I just think he needs to start leveling up his game-to-game consistency. The bad games are still way too bad, and they still cost DRX quite a lot. We saw it in the playoffs when this team was like actually in the playoffs proper. Now, that's obviously, you know, a pretty good bar and a pretty good spot to be in, but he was going up against bot lanes that he should be able to hold his own against, especially because Ondel was really strong in the 2v2. He was getting resources, and then he was just kind of mispositioning in a lot of the mid game, not really capitalizing on a lot of his damage. I just need to see that start to improve before I feel comfortable moving him up more so than these other players, right? Can he be better than someone like Teddy? Absolutely, he can be better than someone like Teddy. Can he be better than someone like Taeyun? Absolutely, he can be better than someone like Taeyun. Some people might think he already is. I think he's in that conversation. They're all around the same grade for me. It's just, you know, Jiwoo has a couple of games where it's just like, man, I really don't feel comfortable with you as a starting AD carry right now, and that needs to get better. That is the big reason why I'm lower on DRX than maybe some other people are going to be, is just because I don't know if the bot lane can repeat their performance from the LCK Cup with what I imagine other bot lanes getting back up to speed. And then you've got the mid-jungle duo, which I think is an easier conversation to have. Willer is exactly who we thought he was for so many years down in the Challengers League. This guy can absolutely tempo and snowball games out of control. Super feast or famine as a player, but that famine can come back to bite this team in a lot of really bad scenarios. He was really bad when they really needed him in the playoffs, and that's just unfortunate, but it is the way that Willer plays. He is going to either win you the game or lose you the game. That's always been his playstyle. The reason, you know, I've always compared him and Raptor so much as players is not only because they came out of the same system, but because I think they have extremely similar playstyles. And while Raptor, I think, has developed a lot more as a mid-game player to be able to stop a lot of the, you know, weird plays that he's making in terms of over-aggressing, Willer has not. Willer has not really taken that next step and become the player that is just going to be more consistent. You're still going to get some unbelievable games out of him. And when you're talking about this team doing well in the regular season like they did, Willer was probably the biggest reason why that ended up happening. So that's obviously a really big plus for him as a player, and him being able to be back in the LCK. Like, him being the starting jungler over Vincenzo is the reason this team, I think, made the playoffs in the LCK Cup, because I don't think Vincenzo would have been good enough to get them there, but I do think he is capped kind of in terms of what he is. He's the jungler that's always going to be good enough to beat the weaker junglers in the league, and someone who I think will naturally always struggle against the top tier junglers in the league because of his playstyle. And while I think that's valuable for DRX in order to make them competitive and in order to keep them out of the bottom tier, you know, I just don't know what that ends up translating to, especially because Yucal was also very hit or miss over the beginning part of the year. I like Yucal a lot. I like the way that he plays the game. I like the way he structures his early games. I think he generates a lot more 1v1 advantages than he gets credit for. But at the end of the day, if you're going to make like one major mistake every game, that's a problem. Like, there's just not really a lot of ways to be able to fix that. His laning is definitely better than what it was in 2025, where it was kind of a nightmare, especially after the LCK Cup. And I don't think we really saw a ton of playmaking instincts down the stretch, but he was stable enough and he was capitalizing on the advantages that his jungler was getting him. Overall, I think he's an okay mid laner to have. I wish I had more to talk about when it comes to Yucal, but really, he was kind of your stock standard, like below average mid laner or average, you know, mid laner, somewhere in that range throughout the LCK Cup. And that just kind of summarizes DRX for me. I think this team is interesting, but I think you're hoping for a lot of upside to kind of come through again. And, you know, we saw a lot of players, I think, not only overperform, but overperform their, you know, bounds during very specific times. We saw players like Willer and Jiwoo play really well in the regular season and in the qualification to get this team into the playoffs, only to, you know, really underperform once they actually got there. You see players like Rich that are super specific in the way they need to play the game and aren't really like ceiling movers, they're floor movers, and I think that's why DRX is at number 8. You have a player in Ondel who I think can raise the ceiling of this team, but historically has gotten worse the more he's played, and someone like Yucal that I don't think was necessarily exceptional. I just think that it's natural to kind of expect DRX to regress a little bit going into the spring split, and while I do think it's definitely possible for them to maintain their spot as a top 6 team and somebody that's really interesting, mostly because I think Willer could just be better than all of the junglers that we're going to talk about in this tier, I think it would have to be more of a team effort with everybody leveling up again and kind of taking that next leap, which right now, personally, I'm just kind of betting against. Then moving on to number 7 in my power rankings, and this is a team I feel like I have too high, but I just can't like put some of these players below number 7 in my power rankings. It's KT Rolster. I really want to imagine that there is a world where this team is top 6 again and like actually performing, but the ancillary pieces on this team are majorly concerning right now in terms of the way that they're playing. You know, as we talked about a lot over the beginning part of the year, I have to believe that BDD is good enough to get this team bare minimum to like a top 7 or 8 finish. Like, they have to be in that zone. They were not in the LCK Cup, where they of course finished 9th and, you know, are a super big disappointment. Being a bottom 2 team for KT Rolster would be a nightmare, but it's really not all that out of the realm of possibility. And I'll kind of talk about what historic precedent is kind of set last year for them to kind of feel like they are concerned about the way that they played at the beginning of the year. But let's go ahead and get into their lineup and just what is going on here. Their lineup now is officially looking like perfect in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Polu at support full-time. Ghost has been demoted to the Challengers League. He will be the starting support for the KT Challengers team. Obviously, that's had a lot of success over the past couple of years, but Polu is getting a full runtime here as the starting support, and I do think this will help the team. Not because I think Polu is definitely better than Ghost. I think a lot of people were kind of just like, well, Polu is definitely better because Ghost makes a lot of mistakes, and I agree. Ghost made a lot of mistakes. Polu didn't make nearly as many mistakes, and Polu was also so much worse in the 2v2. It's actually astounding. Like, it's crazy how much weaker their lane advantages were when Polu was playing versus when Ghost was playing. I really, at the end of the day, was just sitting there going like, both of them have major disadvantages and both of them are clearly below average supports. It's just about what version of the team you want to play for. And really, at this point, it's about just getting one guy in there and letting him, you know, start to communicate. Support is like the most important role in the game right now. Support, jungle, and mid are all just incredibly valuable in terms of the way the map is played. And if your support is constantly switching game over game, you're never really establishing like a vocal synergy between the team, and it was clearly causing a big rift between a rift, I should say, between KT Rolster here, and that is a problem. Like, obviously getting that fixed here should be better, but I don't necessarily think you're just like having the better support come in. I do think you're probably getting the better support here, but it's not quite so simple, right? Polu is a very specific player, and I guess we're already talking about him. We might as well lead off the conversation with him. He is a weak link of this team. He comes in as my number 9 support. I think this position is really weak for KT Rolster. I think Polu was never really all that great on Bro for many years and was a below average support there. There were times where he was okay in terms of being able to play the mid games, and a lot of the skirmishes I think were okay from him, especially when he was pairing up with players like Hype, who I think were a lot more comfortable being able to play out of the late game. Like, once you could get him into these like structured team fight, you know, scenarios, I think he could be more comfortable. But the main thing that we saw again out of Polu was just like how much worse KT Rolster was in the 2v2 when he was on the Rift versus when he wasn't. It was really staggering just how much weaker in the 2v2 they were. Again, he doesn't make make mistakes. He's not really this guy who's going to go out and get caught out and randomly die. Ghost is going to make a lot more negative plays, I think, than Polu will, but Polu doesn't make positive plays. Like, he is just a below average support at this level, and I think he will need to actively be better, not only than what he was for KT, obviously, at the beginning of the year, but he's going to need to be better than what he has been at any point throughout his career on Bro in the LCK up until this point, if he's going to be able to justify this. I promise I am kind of optimistic about this, if only just because he's one support and they're not, swapping in and out. I think 6-man rosters are almost always the wrong decision in terms of being able to play out League of Legends. No great team has actually been able to, really make a 6-man roster work in modern League. I think you could have in, years past, and I think Fearless does introduce some interesting, kind of quirks into that, but I think especially for a position like support, it's just more difficult. Top lane, you can get away with that. Support, maybe not so much. So having one support, I think, will make this team better. Hopefully it will make aiming better, who comes in as my number 7 AD carry. I mean, this guy is just exactly who I've been saying he's been throughout his entire career. People have constantly been badgering me over and over again about my takes on aiming and saying that I'm too low on him and not giving him enough credit when this guy is, leading the entire league in KDA and damage per minute and all of this stuff. And I'm a stats guy. I like looking at stats. I do believe that there was a lot to glean from stats. I think that there were a lot of really interesting things to pull out of, what you can get from statistics. But overall, I think any good analyst will tell you that you need both stats and the eye test. No good analyst is operating only under one of those things. You need both of them, and aiming has never passed the eye test. He does nothing on the Rift in the early game to generate his own advantages. He got to play with some really good supports throughout his career and have much more passive laning phases where he could go neutral or even just a little bit behind to get him into the late game where he can be more aggressive and start to win some of those team fights. But aiming has always been the definition to me of a stats merchant, or the way I described him was a player that is entirely dependent on his surroundings in order to be successful in the way that he wants to be, because his style is not necessarily his choice on whether it works or not. And I think that's the case here on KT. He was with some weak supports, and he performed pretty weak as an AD carry. He never got to the late games, which he's very consistent on, and he had to fight a lot in the early and in the mid game, which he's not very good at, and he looked pretty bad for it. I don't think a lot of that is going to change. I think you can get some stability out of aiming, but I don't think this guy is a top-tier AD carry, even at his absolute best. I think he's an average AD carry at this level in terms of his mechanics, and I think unless you're getting him into these 5v5s where he's a lot more comfortable being able to play front to back, he's not really ever going to look like a star or perform like a star on this team. Not that you kind of want him to, because the middle of the map is clearly where you're focusing a lot of your attention, but it just lowers the ceiling of this team quite a bit. I wasn't a fan of bringing him in the first place. I think Doctum is a better player, and I have them ranked as such right now on this list. Then you have Perfect on the top side, who once again was not particularly good in the regular season, and just raises this question of how much stock do you want to put into his Worlds run, or really the end of the year run from last year. I'm a fan of Perfect. I've always been a big defender of him. I was really a huge advocate for him in the Challengers League, where I thought he was a really underrated prospect coming up to the LCK. He's been fine at the LCK level, just super inconsistent. He can still have those big pop-off games, and I think he's especially good in team fights when you can get him there. He's an okay laner in that same vein. He can generate his own advantages. He's not a dumb player by any stretch. He doesn't have the mechanics to be a superstar at this level. He's just a good player, and I think that means that when they're trying to be better than a lot of these other top laners that are really talented mechanically, he can run into some problems. He loves the matchups where he gets to go up against Rich or Kiwoom or a lot of these players that let him have a free laning phase because he can't be punished nearly as much, and he is able to generate leads in those matchups. But when he's going up against really mechanically talented top laners, he can sometimes struggle to be able to keep up because he just doesn't have the best hands in the entire universe. And that's a problem for a team that kind of needs someone else on this team to step up besides their mid laner. Again, I like Perfect. I think he's the definition of a league average top laner. But again, you have a league average top laner, you have a league average AD carry, you have a below league average support, I would say significantly below league average support. And that means that you have to get production out of the middle of your map. And the reason that this team is at number 7 and not at number 9 is BDD. I mean, this guy is still the GOAT, right? He was still playing phenomenal throughout a majority of the beginning of the year. Maybe not quite as dominant as he was in 2025, probably the best year of his entire career, or even really 2024, where he was also very good for KT. I mean, he's been good for a very long time, but just, you know what I mean? We were looking at King Zone level BDD last year, maybe even better than that in terms of the way he was able to take over games for KT Rolster. He has to be that again, and I still believe you can get that out of him. He just wasn't that in the LCK Cup. He was just a very good mid laner, somebody who could be borderline top 4 in terms of the mid lane rankings. That's not good enough. He needs to be a 1v9, drag this team across the finish line kind of mid laner. The reason they come in at number 7 is because I do think he will be that. I think he's going to be pretty motivated coming out of, you know, what was a really bad LCK Cup performance. We know that BDD is a riser. He's somebody who rises to the occasion and kind of can drag a team up in the standings a lot of the time, and I think he's good enough to do that. I think Cuz is also kind of due a bounce back. Jungle is really weak right now in the LCK in terms of the positions. At least it's weak in terms of consistency. It's weak in terms of players that you like feel super comfortable are going to be dominant basically no matter what. I had Cuz at number 5 in my rankings for a long time. You can probably guess the player that leapfrogged him, but at the end of the day, I honestly just felt more comfortable with Cuz as a player, and I think he's still in a good spot to be able to generate a lot of tempo here. But Cuz was a player that really struggled a lot last year when they didn't have strong support play. When Wei was starting as the starting support for KT Rolster, this team was bottom 2 in the LCK. They were not only bottom 2 in the standings, they were bottom 2 in everybody's power rankings. They were looking like a team that was going to be disappointing in the spring split. And then they figured it out. Peter came in as the starting support. You got a lot more playmaking out of that spot. You got to move him around, and Cuz got to be more aggressive in terms of how he played the mid games, and everything just kind of fell into place a little bit more, you know, standardly with the way that they wanted to operate. The problem for Cuz is, once again, I just don't think you have a particularly good support here, and it's a support that wants to play more for the bottom side of the map, which I think is a bad, you know, combination. I think it's very possible that Cuz is not a top half jungler here in terms of production. This team is BDD and friends. Like, maybe you get good performances out of Cuz and aiming and perfect, and maybe even Polu, and that would be awesome. That would make this team a top 6, but there is no world where this team is living up to their own expectations. They were in World Finals last year, and this does not feel like a team that's going to sniff an international appearance this year. That's disappointing. I think BDD is still a superstar. I just don't really trust any of the other pieces on this team. Then moving on to number 6 in my power rankings, and this is my first projected playoff team and the top of my C tier. Like I said, really not a lot separating this team from even like number 9 in my personal power rankings with just how these teams have broken down, but it's the team that performed by far the best in split number 1 in the team I have the most confidence in. It's the DN SOOPers coming in at number 6 for me. Kind of a shocking result considering just how low I was talking about this team for a majority of the regular season, but they figured it out. Peter came in as the full-time starting support, and everything started to click once again for an org that has kind of just been terrible, like objectively terrible over the past couple of years. I've gone on a lot of rants on this channel, and some people are even laughing at me in the comments because, you know, the moment I go on this giant rant about the freaks, whether they're Afrika or Kwangdong or DN, and now the DN SOOPers, like this organization in general has been so bad at developing talent and about taking anybody who comes through the building and getting the best out of them that it's almost comical. Like, you can basically name any player that has been on their roster and they have done better the moment they either left the DN, you know, SOOPers or the freaks, or, you know, before they got to the organization in the first place. In some cases, it's both, with a player like Berserker now, once again, going back and winning North America, but finally, it feels like towards the end of the regular season, towards the beginning part of the play-in stage, something started to click for this org and for this team, and a lot of the players that we knew had talent were able to actually, I don't know, utilize that talent in some pretty big and important games and get themselves actually into the playoffs, a top 5 finish for them at the start of the year. It's a really great accomplishment, and you're hopeful that they're going to be able to keep it up. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Dr. at AD carry, and Peter at support. It's really easy to talk about this team in a lot of different ways because I think that their archetypes, like the roles that they fill on this team, are very specific, and I think everybody kind of fills that role well. The number 1 player that I want to talk about here is Dudu on the top side. Finally, this guy is starting to get back to some of that form that we were talking about in 2023 and 2024 when he was looking like he could potentially break through as one of the better top laners in the LCK. I believe it was the beginning of 2024 or the end of 2023, like the preseason, you know, going into 2024, where I said that this guy had all the tools in the world to be a top 3 top laner in the league. It never really blossomed or developed into that, but I think that had more to do with circumstance and situation than it ever did with talent. With Dudu, it felt like he was mentally checked out, especially last year, where it felt like he really was not all that locked in for a team that was an utter disaster. But now that this team has some pieces around him again, you can start to get excited about him potentially having that confidence back, being able to lock in and really start to dominate in the 1v1 again. He is incredibly mechanically talented, and that's what I don't think he gets nearly enough credit for. There have been times where I think he's been like a top 2 or 3 mechanical top laner in the LCK in terms of what he can do in the 1v1, isolated in winning matchups. Now, it's not always going to be that simple for him. He can be decently feast or famine in some bad games. He's okay at playing weak side. I think that's a big plus of his game, is that he's more flexible than maybe you would think of a player of his archetype or his kind of skill set. But what he's really good at is being able to make sure that the early laning phase is in a spot where he can transition that into a strong mid game. And that's really valuable for Grubs right now, for Rift Herald right now. You want to play towards the top side. We saw teams like BLG just overload the top side over and over again at first stand. I think DNS can actually fill a decently similar role in terms of how these players end up performing and, where they want to put their resources if they really want to put all that isolated attention on the top side. Dudu is a very, very special top laner. It's really just about which version of him is going to show up. He looked a lot better in the LCK Cup. If he can get back to where he was a couple of years ago, I mean, again, that guy was as good as any of the other top laners that are going to be listed above him. Maybe not Keen, right? But like anybody below that, I think you could make an argument that Dudu would be in that tier if he can continue to elevate his game back to where it's been in previous years. I do want to talk about the bot lane at least a little bit here. Duktum and Peter finally actually getting runtime as the starting bot lane. I assume Peter will once again continue to be the starting support. They put him in basically at the end of the regular season going into the play-in stage, and he basically plays the entire play-in stage. It gets this team into the playoffs after a terrible regular season, and they win a playoff series because Peter is that much better than all of the other supports that, every other team that Peter is on seem to think are, better than Peter. I don't really understand why this guy is constantly having to fight for his job in the LCK, because every single time he plays, he makes his team better. Even if he is individually not like dominating a lot of these games, it's clear he's a very vocal leader in terms of the in-game communications, and I think it's his playmaking instincts that just makes things easier for his jungler and his mid laner to be able to open up the map a lot more. He is not a passive support. He is not somebody that's going to sit back and kind of wait for the game to come to him. He's going to push the tempo of basically every game that he plays, and it really helps out his team because Duktum is like your pinnacle jack of all trades AD carry. If you need him to play weak side, he can do that. If you want to play strong side, Peter is better in the 2v2 than he gets credit for. Still not a strength, I would say, of his. I think he's much more comfortable playing, Rakan or Bard or champion Nico, champions like that can move around the map and create more chaos with the jungler, but he can definitely play for the 2v2 early because Duktum loves to play things like Caitlyn and be able to generate those 2v2 advantages. Duktum's okay in late game team fights. He really gets good once he starts getting into like these, 40-minute team fights where everybody has a ton of gold. That's where I think he really shines as a 5v5 player. Not so much in terms of like the standard setups around a lot of like third or fourth dragons. I think he can sometimes struggle in those particular fights, but Duktum is that jack of all trades, master of none type of ADC that, is going to be valuable, generally speaking. I think he's never going to be a superstar. He can have some great games every once in a while, but you kind of know what you're getting game in and game out, and he is more of a product of the system, but in a way where he's never going to like require resources. He's just going to do his own thing. That's where he's different, in my opinion, than players like Aiming and Teddy that are a little bit lower on this list than Duktum. Is that while those players are also kind of a product of their system, I think they're a product of their system in a way where they kind of need to be set up to do the things that they want to do. Duktum, I think, needs no assistance in order to just be the guy that he is, and he can still do things if he does get resources in the early game. So I really like this bot lane. Hopefully Life is not playing again for this team. All due respect to Life as a support, Peter is just better than him, and he will make this team better if he continues to play. And that's opened up a lot of the middle of the map too. Closer has been, pretty good over the past couple of years. I was really hyping him up last year on Bro, where I think individually you could even make the case that was one of his more impressive splits or years of all time last year on Bro, even if the team success wasn't necessarily there, because he was actually winning the 1v1 significantly more consistently than he ever was when he was on FearX or, Sandbox back in the day. Even the T1 situation is very different, but Closer was never really a dominant 1v1 player in terms of being able to consistently get resources. He was last year on Bro, and he's carried that over. He's a good mid laner. This guy is a borderline, best of the rest type of mid laner. 6 or 7 in terms of the mid lane rankings is not to be, oh, how is this guy below average? It's just like the top 5 are all unbreakable. And so if you're number 6 or number 7 in these mid lane rankings, you are the best of the rest. You're the best non-top 10 player in the world in the mid lane in the LCK, which is still a pretty big accomplishment. So I do have a lot of faith in Closer. He's expanded his champion pool quite a bit from the days where he could really only play a lot of those assassins or more aggressive picks in the mid lane. I think he's valuable to this team, and he adds a layer of stability that they kind of desperately need, because Peter can be a bit inconsistent. Dudu, we know, can be a bit inconsistent, and certainly Pioshik can be a bit inconsistent here in the jungle. But what a nice bounce back from a player that I really thought was completely cooked in Pioshik. I lambasted this team for bringing him back at the beginning of the year, because to me, there was really not a lot of justification for Pioshik coming back in 2026 after how everything happened. I mean, I was calling for this guy to go into the Challengers League last year, when this team was just not winning, clearly the worst team in the LCK. I was like, what are we even doing? Why are we even wasting our time? We might as well get some sort of Challengers League jungler into this spot and just see if we can, make that work. But Pioshik definitely kind of proved me wrong a little bit in the winter split. I'm hopeful that he can keep it up. He is a very feast or famine player. We've seen him, even since he's come back from North America, have good starts like he did on KT Rolster that first year, and then basically completely fall off for the rest of the year and be super inconsistent. I'm really hopeful that's not the case. It's kind of a similar conversation to what we talked about with someone like Ondel earlier, where I am taking a bit more of a wait and see, but Pyosik was encouraging in terms of how he could generate his advantages aggressively, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he had some really good lanes throughout a lot of the winter split. And if that's going to keep up, which I think it probably will, Dudu's a good laner. I think Doctum and Peter can be good in the 2v2. Peter's going to, either win in the 2v2 or spend resources to get Pyosik into a good spot, so that should be fine. Closer's been really good in the 1v1 in the mid lane. If those things are going to stay constant, his job's really not all that hard in terms of what he needs to do for this team. He just needs to be aggressive and continue to control tempo and basically push the pace of the game forward to allow the others to use the resources that they're pretty good at generating. The Soopers really impressed me in their playoff run. While they weren't as good in the regular season, and usually that is a bit of a concern to me because, these playoff miracles typically aren't super repeatable for LCK teams, just in terms of like the longevity. 20 game sample size is usually better than like a 5 or an 8 game sample size or anything like that. But I think what we saw towards the end of the split, once Peter came in and this team really started to settle on their identity, once they got their starting 5 in, I think that is the version that I'm kind of expecting them to be. And that version is a competitive team, a team that I kind of expect to make top 6, to make playoffs, and to be a team that actually does compete, maybe to be that best of the rest at the top of C tier. But then moving on to number 5 in my power rankings, and this is where we really start to make that jump. We are up into my B tier. These are teams that, while I think are very good, I think actually have, more limitations than maybe they're getting credit for. Some of them are getting too much credit for their limitations, which we'll talk about here with number 5. But these are teams that I think are potential teams to go to MSI. Maybe not favorites to go to MSI, but are teams that I think are good enough to represent the region internationally. And that starts at number 5 for me with Hanwha Life Esports, the most disappointing team of the LCK Cup without any sort of exception. This team for me is coming in at number 5. That's 5 spots above what they actually finished in the LCK Cup. Of course, getting 10th, getting last place, because that format was absolutely ridiculous. I continue to hate that format, and I know, some people really like it. Not for me, not the format that I'm gonna die on a hill for, certainly not. But for Hanwha Life, I think they're definitely going to be coming back here in the spring split with some vengeance on their mind, with some bounce back potential. Basically, all 5 of these players ended up really underperforming their own expectations. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to freak out too much. I think that there were some other teams that definitely deserve to be given some credit for how they performed over the course of last split, but this is not a team where I'm sitting here and going like, oh, I think they're going to be a borderline playoff team. I think they're just barely better than the DN SOOPers. No, I think this is really where you start teams that, once again, can absolutely get top 2 and qualify for MSI. It's really just about the form that they're going to be in. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is, of course, still looking like Zeus in the top lane, Kanavi in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Delight at support. We can really go top to support here, kind of down the line, talking about both what went wrong for each individual player, because things went wrong for everybody here, and also why I think there's not a lot of reason to expect it to continue. Zeus is probably the most concerning for me in terms of what actually went wrong, mostly because he just was getting clobbered in the 1v1, which is super bad. Like, that is not what you want to see out of a player of Zeus's caliber or quality, specifically of his playstyle, because what you really look at for Zeus to do is be able to generate so much tempo on the top side that teams basically have to react to him. That's what he'd done, on T1 for a majority of his career. It's what he did last year on HLE when he was playing really well at the beginning of the year when that team won first stand, is he was just generating so much priority on the top side that teams basically were forced into a situation where they either had to answer him or lose the game, and that opened up more opportunities for the rest of the map to be more aggressive throughout a lot of the mid game. The problem for Zeus is that this guy was bleeding out on the top side every single game, like legit the worst he's ever played at any point throughout his entire career. I've covered, I think, every single game that he has played at a tier 1 level on this channel over the past many years that we've been doing the LCK. This guy has never played as bad as he did in the winter split. I think he was objectively the worst player on Hanwha Life in terms of the process and just the way that he was losing, because there was no attention put into him by enemy teams. He was just losing in the 1v1 every single game. Obviously, that's a pretty major concern, and I am worried that that is just going to be something that happens to him for the rest of the year. But, I mean, come on. Like, it's so out of character for Zeus to get so slaughtered in the top lane that you have to hope he's going to be able to bounce back. If he doesn't, you can bet your ass he's going to plummet in these rankings. He's not going to be the number 3 top laner if he plays anywhere close to the way he did in the winter split, but I am giving him a bit of the benefit of the doubt, mostly because he has shown himself to be decently inconsistent in the past, and that means that there is a chance that he just recovers and is good again. That's what I'm leaning on for most of this team, but specifically for Zeus, because I think his tape was by far the most egregious. As for Kanavi in the jungle, I think people are really going to focus on him because of the narrative just generally surrounding Hanwha Life, where the team's macro was quite bad. Kanavi, obviously, the new piece coming in to replace Peanut, somebody who was very macro focused. As a jungler, Kanavi, a very different player, much more aggressive in terms of how he wants to play the early game. I don't think you could perhaps get more different in terms of playstyles from Kanavi and Peanut, but I think when you go back and watch the tape, at least from my perspective, I don't really think Kanavi was like the biggest problem in a lot of those games. I think his KDAs are probably worse than his gameplay was. I think there were a lot of times where he did lose tempo, but I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that his laners were running it for a lot of the split, and he just is not a player that's good at playing from behind. He's very snowbally. He's probably the best early game jungler of all time in terms of what he's been able to do across his career, but if he is like forced to play neutral in the mid to late game, like that's where you take Kanavi out of his comfort zone. That's where he struggled internationally, is that he's not able to get those leads as consistently in the early game against great competition, and you know that wasn't happening here, and so Kanavi kind of had to play a role that was really anti his own skill set. I think if the laners are better, Kanavi will be better. He was more of a product, in my opinion, of what was wrong with Hanwha Life rather than being a direct cause for what that problem was. He still needs to play better, and I think that there are a lot of people that would not make him a top 3 jungler after what they saw, but I think the KDA is definitely weaker than the performance itself. I think the stats would not necessarily tell you that this guy was kind of in a bad spot for a majority of the of the winter split of the LCK Cup, whatever you want to call it. And I think he will be better moving into split number 2, or at least I'm hoping he will. Zeka is another player I am a bit concerned about. Again, there's a big 5 in terms of mid laners, but with the performance he gave, he definitely fell to the bottom of that list, especially because he ended the year last year with such a poor performance, in my opinion, in comparison to his like career norms. I've always been a massive Zeka defender. It's the thing that kind of blew this channel up in the first place, was me making Zeka like an MVP caliber pick in 2022, and you know, talking about how he's going to pop off at Worlds, and then he goes and does it and wins like World Finals and you know all of this stuff, right? Like Zeka's a big channel darling in that regard because of just how much he's done for the reputation. I think I can confidently say for the first time in summer of last year, like that was the first time I ever watched Zeka and went like, oh, it's not there right now. Like even all the other times when people were complaining about the Corki not being good enough or him being inconsistent, it was all over dramatized because people really like to claim things in the LCK. They like to see one moment of weakness and say that a player is cooked, and it never is the case. It just happens all the time in the fan base. But last summer, I think, was a real case of like, oh, Zeka lost a lot of his confidence, and it's just kind of not there right now. He starts out this year with a lot of confidence, but his team is kind of running it down, and then he loses a lot of confidence by the end of the split because the team is not performing well. So I'm very concerned about Zeka. He's a very mental player in terms of how he likes to operate in the mid game. The thing that makes Zeka super different as a, you know, playmaker is that he's probably the best side laning mid laner like in the world when he's at his absolute best. That's something people rarely talk about, but he's a very good laner. He's probably the best mid game mid laner like at his best in the world, and he needs to get back to that. He needs to start playing side lanes and play off Kanavi, who can get those early game leads. But a lot of that comes down to the bot lane for me. And Guma and Delight did not have any chemistry to start the year. That was a big concern for people in the preseason. I kind of, you know, eschewed that concern, if only because we saw this team play in Kespa Cup, and I was like, you know, it was fine in Kespa Cup. They looked more than good enough to be able to take down most of the other teams in the LCK, but something happened in the regular season where it just felt like they were always on different pages. Guma and Delight individually, I don't think always played bad, but one of them was always playing bad, which is like that's a problem, right? Like you need some consistency. I think that is the word that I want to use here, is you just need some, you know, consistency game to game from players on this team, from anybody on this team. And Guma and Delight were certainly not offering that. Delight coming off of one of the better years of his career in 2025. I think he took some major regressive steps in terms of the plays he was looking for. It felt like he was making a lot of those Lehens style mistakes where he was stepping too far forward and just costing his team resources for no reason because he was trying to get vision in a situation where his team hadn't necessarily set up for it. I think Delight's going to be fine. He's another player that I'm really just not all that concerned by. I think a lot of his problems came more from the team and just the lack of map setup rather than his individual bad plays, although he had a couple of really bad team fights, and it's clear his mental was also getting a little worse as the split ended. Gumayushi, I really don't know how to feel about. He is the furthest dropper. He goes from number 2 to number 4 in my AD carry rankings, mostly because I just don't really know what to expect out of him. He was a very different player on T1 than what a lot of the HLE AD carry, like, rotating cast has been, even before they ended up getting the super team, right? Back when they had Deft and, you know, Chovy on this roster. Like, they've always looked for a very specific type of AD carry. Obviously, Viper kind of filling that role for a very long time. Gumayushi is not that kind of player. He is somebody that is going to be valuable, but valuable in a way where you do kind of want him to be a part of the puzzle. Viper was really consistent for this team because he could kind of take a back seat if needed. He's one of the more consistent weak side AD carries, and while Guma is a very good weak side AD carry, it's mostly because his support, you know, is there to be the main character, right? Like, Keria was more the main character than Gumayushi was. Delight also doesn't really really want to be the main character on this team. He's a really good playmaker, but that's not really what they want to play for. It's just a weird fit a little bit with Gumayusi, and I think it's going to take them some time to figure out exactly how they want to use him, whether that's strong side in the 2v2, because I think this team could actually be so much better if they just played into this Enchanter meta and allowed Gumayusi to play Caitlyn every single game. I think that would really help out what they want to do. He's, of course, a great Varus player in that same vein. We know he can play a lot of the other early game ADCs. Kalista has always been a big pick for Gumayusi. I think that would be the most consistent way to play this bot lane 2v2, but if you really need Guma to play weak side, don't shy away from just picking Jhin or Ezreal. I know people don't like them, but I think it, again, fits the identity of this team. I think you too often were putting Guma in a situation where he felt like he needed to hyper carry, and quite frankly, that's the thing he's the worst at as an AD carry, and I think I would just personally shy away from that. But if you can't tell from my tone, I'm kind of optimistic that HLE is going to figure it out. I had them basically at number 3 throughout the power rankings of the entire regular season. Now, there were a couple of teams that very much did well for themselves in the playoffs, enough so that they rose above an HLE team that didn't get a chance to show anything in best of fives. But at the end of the day, I'm really not all that worried about Hanwha Life being competitive. It's just how competitive. It's clear that these players aren't the most synergistic in terms of how things are coming together, but you need good lanes in order for Kanavi to be able to push forward. If you get that, if these players can just start being mechanically better than the middle of the LCK, every team that we've talked about from number 6 down in this video, they're going to be just fine. They can probably even do that against number 3 and 4 on this list as well in terms of my rankings. So I really don't worry too much about HLE as long as they're able to actually live up to their own mechanical prowess, which I imagine they'll be able to do. Then moving on to number 4 in my power rankings, and this is where we start to get to some teams that performed really well in the LCK Cup, and it's all really about just how they can keep it going. Coming in at number 4 for me in the middle of this B tier, it is going to be Dplus KIA. I don't think a lot of people are going to have them in other spots. There's potentially some people that might have them in 5th, and I can kind of understand maybe why you'd want to put them there, but for me, they are a top 4 team right now. They were clearly a top 3 team in the winter split in terms of their production, but there are some major question marks in terms of what this team is going to look like moving forward. They pull off a massive upset in the playoffs, a reverse sweep over a team that is higher than them on this tier list, but I do believe that, DK is a team that can continue to threaten for, some upper tier spots, that can threaten to try to get top 2, but just might not have the firepower to be able to make that happen consistently unless you get some major improvement from some players that I'm going to talk about here. So let's go ahead and get into it. Their lineup is looking like Shiwu in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, Smash at AD carry, and Career at support. Obviously, this team is pretty easy to talk about. Showmaker is what Showmaker has been for basically like 5 years in a row now, maybe less than that, somewhere around 5 years in a row. He's not quite prime Showmaker in terms of taking over the game and dominating. The closest we've really seen him come to that is probably last year's LCK Cup in 2025, where he was just unbelievable until that team ended up bombing out top 3 as well and not being able to make first stand. They never were able to keep that up again. It was really unfortunate, but Showmaker has kind of settled in very quietly as like the definition of a B+ caliber, mid laner at this level, where he's going to be super stable, super consistent, very, very easy to play around, and somebody who's going to constantly take care of games where he's playing against players that he is better than, and maybe struggle a bit at being able to be like that difference-making MVP caliber player, right? He is the separator, as I like to call it, between the great mid laners, like the best in the world kind of mid laners, and just like the very, very good mid laners. He's a top 20 player in the world, maybe not so much a top 10 player in the world at this point in his career, but still, Showmaker's a very valuable player, and he is the best player on this team. He was for a majority of the regular season in the same vein. I think they're still obviously very happy to have him. He seems very motivated right now to continue to bring a lot of success to this organization because that, the org hasn't found it in recent years, and I think he takes a bit of personal responsibility for that, considering he is kind of the face of the franchise now that Canyon has gone on to have such, a good second part of his career here on Gen.G. I think Showmaker definitely feels like the Damwon guy forever, and, we'll see how the rest of this year takes him. I think he is a good leader for them to have, but he's not the player I'm concerned about, and he's not the reason they're at number 4. It's everybody else on this team that kind of keeps them at number 4, and we're going to talk about it. I'm high on the bot lane here, and I have a lot of faith that they're going to continue to grow. They're just a little bit predictable right now, which I think does get them into some trouble. I really like Smash. I mean, he is exactly what he is, right? Like, he can play weak side. He's actually okay playing weak side if you need him to do so. He was pretty good at that when he was asked to do it during the regular season in the LCK Cup, but the real thing that Smash does is pick a hyper carry, become strong side, and play for late game team fights. It's what he does at a really high-end level. He's a very smart mid-game skirmisher in the same vein. The only problem that he has is he's really not all that good of a laner in the 2v2, and it's kind of the meta right now to be a good 2v2 laner. We saw that a bit in the semifinals when they took on FearX, where Diablo was just a little bit more aggressive in terms of generating those resources in the 2v2, and Smash really couldn't quite keep up. In that same vein, he is ranked kind of just outside that upper echelon. Again, one spot below Gumayushi. You can probably guess who the top 380 carries are because we've yet to talk about them in this video, but Smash is still a player I really like. I think if he can continue to grow and get even better at playing the 2v2, that's really the only thing lacking for him to be one of the best AD carries in the world. Like, he's already one of the more mechanically talented players in the world, and certainly one of the better team fighters, one of the better players at being able to capitalize on resources. If he can just get to that point where he's generating a lot of them on his own through aggressive tendencies, or alternatively just through being able to win, neutral matchups a little bit better, not having to draft for that dominant 2v2 on the bottom side in the same way that some other teams might have to. I think that's really what unlocks this bot lane. Career still coming in at number 7 for me. Some people are going to get upset by this ranking because he was pretty good throughout a majority of the split. I just don't see Career all that differently than how I saw him at the beginning of the year. I was already pretty high on this bot lane. It's why they're not really moving all that much. They didn't have a lot to prove to me in terms of being good, and they were exactly that. I mean, again, Career comes in one spot below someone like Peter. You might say that that's ridiculous considering how Career played at times in the playoffs, but Career was also much more inconsistent, and I think that's kind of where I go back to just like full tape evaluations and not just, oh, X player played well. And did you see X player played well in one series? Did you see Career outplayed KIA at the end of the series against T1? That means Career is better than KIA. I think any analyst like that actually is paying attention would never, talk like that. Like, there's just no reason to have that opinion under any circumstance. But generally, like, Career did have some ups and downs in the regular season. He started to settle in when they needed him, and I thought he did look really good in their wins, but in their losses, especially in the playoffs, when you're talking about the beginning of the series against T1, before obviously he goes back, has an emotional moment, is able to compose himself and plays really well the rest of that series, and then obviously the series against FearX where Kellen was just infinitely better as a support in terms of what he was producing. Like, those are real concerning moments for me, and that's not to say that he's a bad player, just that if he wants to ascend into being like a top 3 or 4 support at this level, he needs to kind of clean those up, and I think he can. I honestly bet on the fact that Smash and Career are not going to be number 5 and number 7 heading into the summer version of this video, but I don't rank based on what I bet is going to happen. I rank based off what I, what kind of floor I think these players have. And I think Smash's floor is around a middle table AD carry, probably an upper half AD carry, but one that still has some inconsistencies. And Career is just going to have some good games and some bad games until he proves that he can find that consistency from game to game. Then we get to the top side discussion, and this is where I think things get more interesting when it comes to Dplus KIA. Lucid is the real key to this team, as he has been for many, many years at this point when it comes to DK, where his performance is going to determine how far this team can go. Unfortunately, I just don't know if Lucid's that guy, and I really hate to say that, but it really does feel like every single time that we're getting hyped up about Dplus KIA and getting hyped up about this mid-jungle duo finally being able to make that leap into being one of the best in the world, then Lucid kind of comes crashing back down to earth, and he doesn't show up in big moments, and he has these inconsistent tendencies. Really, I hate to say it, but what I see from tape, and I know there's a lot of big Lucid fans, even in my comment section, but what I see from the tape is a player that is really good at playing within structure and just not a star. Like, I don't see a star player in Lucid right now. Hopefully he can prove me wrong. There have been flashes. Again, the LCK Cup last year in 2025 was a huge flash that Lucid could be a top 10 player in the world, but outside of that, we've really not seen any consistent tape from Lucid at a tier 1 level that would prove that he can be like a ton better than this. He reminds me of the kind of player that can have like a Cuz-like trajectory, maybe, not the same style, like a very different player, but somebody who's always a good jungler at the LCK level, maybe even an above average jungler at the LCK level, but not somebody who's ever going to be able to like break games or be an MVP caliber player. It just doesn't feel like there's anything in there for Lucid in that regard. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that eventually starts to come through, but right now he feels like a good player at playing within structure. He's fine at being able to control tempo. He just doesn't make the X factor plays that a lot of other big junglers make, and I think it does hold him back a bit, and it holds Dplus KIA back in those big series where he does get out jungled and out tempoed by the best junglers in the league. So I'm hopeful that he can turn it around, but for now, he's coming in as my number 6 jungler. I honestly feel worse about him coming into spring than I did going into winter, which is unfortunate. And then Shiwu is exactly who we thought he was, a weak laner and a really good team fighter. He didn't really get taken advantage of nearly as much as maybe you wanted to see him get taken advantage of, because you want this guy to grow, like to learn to get better in that area, but he is fine. He is a totally serviceable top lane, as we saw with a lot of the other teams towards the top of the standings. Like, you can be fine at top lane and still win the league. Maybe not win the league, right? That's a pretty big bar to hit right now, but certainly be competitive and be top 2 and go to MSI, all of that stuff. You can be in that zone with just an okay top laner. I certainly don't think Shiwu gates this team from being strong, but the two players that have to make that leap, that have to step up, in my opinion, are Lucid specifically in the jungle. I think he's by far the most important player. He basically has to be a top 3 jungler for this team to have any chance of getting top 2, in my opinion. or career in the support position, and probably both. They probably both need to make that leap. I think career is more likely to make that leap. Right now, I am quite a bit concerned about Lucid and just about what the upside looks like for him as a player. I think he might just turn into that high floor, low ceiling type of player, which is definitely a bit frustrating, but, you know, Smash is really good, and you can play for him, and Showmaker is still in very good form. He's still one of the better players in the world, you know, top 20, like I said. I just don't know if you have any superstar talent on this team right now, unless Smash really just, like, pops off. I think you kind of need career to develop for that to happen. But DK, to me, feel like a very strong team that's going to consistently be difficult to deal with in the LCK, that maybe just don't have the juice to get top 2 like maybe they want. Then moving on to number 3 in my personal power rankings, and this is a team that I think a lot of people have a lot of thoughts and a lot of opinions on, but coming in at number 3 for me, off of an international appearance, it's BNK FearX. Third in my power rankings. This is, of course, a huge upgrade from where they were in my preseason rankings, where I did not think they were going to be able to utilize their synergy to do as well as they did at the end of last year. Oops, that wasn't right. That was not correct at all. It turns out Vikla is actually a good mid laner, and that's not really something I was necessarily expecting. Outside of that, while there is a lot of adjustment and moving up in a lot of these rankings, I still think that this team succeeds in the same exact way and fails in the same exact way that they always have. It's really just about if you can get those players that, you know, succeed for this team into a good spot. They're basically, you know, the top tier version of what Sandbox was in 2022 with that Krakow, Prince, Kyle team that ended up not being able to make Worlds, but came dangerously close to representing the region internationally when this org kind of felt like they were at their lowest. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss when it comes to this team. Their lineup is still looking like Clear in the top lane, Raptor in the jungle, Vikla in the mid lane, Diablo at AD carry, and Kellen at support. When we talk about the way that they performed at first stand, I think it's actually kind of a nuanced conversation, right? Because they take BLG to 5 games. That's a really good look. Then they go out and get 3-0'd by G2, and that is like worst case scenario for them. Obviously, it becomes a little bit better when G2 goes out and beats Gen.G as well, which we'll talk about later on in these power rankings, but it's hard to get a real read on where FearX kind of land coming out of first stand. I think generally I have the same opinion of them as I had coming out of the LCK. I don't think anything international kind of changed my mind. Maybe I'm a little bit higher on Raptor specifically, but outside of that, I think this team is exactly who we thought they were, which is a super flippy team that can win or lose basically any game that they play. They play one very specific style, and if you can shut down that style, they're going to have a hard time adapting. That's what happened in the finals and the upper bracket finals against Gen.G domestically, is they rely entirely on 2v2 pressure on the bottom side. Diablo and Kellen are FearX, and Raptor is a part of that equation, but Raptor is not a carry, right? Like he can, but he's not the kind of guy that's going to go out there and be good enough for you to be a top 2 or 3 team off the back of him alone. The reason that this team is 3rd in the power rankings, and the reason that they just, you know, came out and got to the finals, their first ever finals, went to their first ever major international tournament in organization history, is because of this bot lane. And that's what you have to look at. That's what you have to focus on if you are a FearX fan. Diablo, for me, is moving up in these rankings. He's a top 3 AD carry for me. I think there's an argument that he could even be 2nd. The only thing that really holds pause for me is not only that he is a very specific player in how he needs to win, because he's really not like the most stable player in the world. It's that he does often falter against a lot of pressure, and specifically against bot lanes that are just going to be able to kind of take the fight to him. I think specifically when you watch those Gen.G series, in both of those series, both the upper bracket finals and the grand finals in the LCK, you could pretty easily say that he was the weakest player on the Rift, because when Diablo is losing, he's losing. Like he is going to lose you the game. He doesn't really play from behind because of how aggressive he is, and if he's going to give over resources, it's going to be kind of hard for him to get back into games. That being said, we all know what the upside and the good for Diablo looks like, and he still is that, I would say 85 or 90% of the time, which is more than good enough to be a top 3 AD carry in the LCK, and almost certainly a top 5 AD carry in the world in terms of what he's turned into. He is the anchor and the heartbeat of this team. He is the laser that will fire through the defenses of whoever they play against, and he's either going to, you know, destroy them, or he's going to lose them the game. Like there's really not a ton of in between. He's the most mechanically talented AD carry I've maybe ever covered on this channel. Reminds me a ton of Elk and Jackie Love in that regard, where it's just like your hands are just unbelievably good. It's actually just absurd, and he does have the awareness in team fights to be able to capitalize on that in the same way that I think a prime Jackie Love did. I think that is actually a really good comparison for Diablo. It's like a prime Invictus Gaming Jackie Love when he went and won Worlds in 2018, like 2019 Jackie Love, that version of him, even 2022 Jackie Love on Top Esports, I think is a great comparison for who Diablo can be as a player, and he's really become that. Like there's no more potential. He is the present. And then then Kellen is the other big piece. I know Kellen is not always the most like loved support in the world, but he's perfect for this meta because he's an enchanter player first and foremost, and he gets to really focus on the 2v2, and more importantly, because he is such a smart shot caller and such a good macro presence on the team, he gets to be kind of the one operating the laser that is Diablo and kind of pointing him into the direction that he needs to go in. The biggest issue for Kellen is he doesn't really have the mechanics to be able to deal with the best players in the world, and so if he does have to go out there and be a big playmaker in team fights, he can sometimes struggle in that role in the same way that he did on Dplus KIA many years ago. I think it's not nearly as relevant in this meta as maybe it would be in others, but he is also just a very specialized player. I think he's perfect. He's a perfect fit alongside Diablo, and I think being able to retain these two is the reason that this org has found so much success at the beginning of this year, but they are the heartbeat. If Kellen and Diablo are winning the 2v2, generating advantages, Diablo is going to torch you in the late game. He is the best AD carry in the league, I think even including Ruler, spoiler alert, who's #1 on this list. He is the best AD carry in the league at taking a gold lead and ending the game with it. Like, there is just nobody who is more oppressive to play into than Diablo, because he's constantly going to be looking to fight you and take away more resources from you. Same thing for Kellen, who's always going to be pushing forward. The problem is, if they don't get that, if they roll and they get one of those games where they're down 20 CS, they're weaker than a lot of the other bot lanes that are going to be around this top tier. So just a very feast or famine style, but by far the most important part of FearX. And Raptor plays into that. Now, Raptor is less feast or famine than I'm giving him credit for. I think I'm at the point now where I have to kind of move off of the analysis that I've been giving for Raptor for years, because for years it's been correct that he is a feast or famine jungler. The good games are going to look great. The bad games are going to look really bad. I think he's really stabilized this year specifically for this team, and if that version of him is real, that is really excellent. That's why he moves up so much. A top 5 jungler for me, top half jungler. I think you could very easily make him #4 over someone like Cuz. I just think that Cuz really never had a chance to be able to play throughout a lot of the LCK Cup. I'm not blaming him for why KT was bad. Maybe I will across the rest of this year, but Raptor's a borderline top 4, top 3, kind of jungler in the league right now, and he has that kind of performance. I know I keep throwing caveats out there before I describe Raptor, but like, this is a great example, probably the best example in this video of a player where it's like, how can you have Raptor #5 instead of #3? If you're typing that comment, I promise you, man, I promise you don't need to type it. Like, he can be #3. Our opinions are probably not all that different, I assure you. I definitely feel comfortable with him at #3 if you wanted to put him there. The only thing for Raptor is I just don't think he has the versatility right now in terms of when he wants to go for his plays in order to be like a superstar, like a top 1 or 2 jungler in the LCK. And that's only just because he does follow a very similar formula game to game. I think he is the kind of player that is very repetition-based in terms of how he wants to approach his mid-games. And if you kind of identify that, as we saw with a lot of teams, specifically G2 at MSI, or at First Stand, not MSI, at First Stand, then you can take him out of his game. I think Skewmon did a great job of being able to identify exactly where Raptor was going to be for a majority of their series and kind of countering that, because Raptor is decently predictable in terms of his pathing. But when he's able to get it off, like when he's able to generate resources, he's a great skirmisher, one of the best in the entire league, regardless of position, but especially for junglers. I think he's awesome at being able to get his laners leads. He's really active in terms of getting his bot lane into a good spot, and he can be a good team fighter. It's not his strength, but he can be good in that phase. I think he is decently complete. He's just a bit predictable in terms of his rotations. It's the only thing holding him out of the upper tier. But again, you want this guy at #3? I have no problem with that. He was the 3rd best jungler in Winter. I'm happy to acknowledge that. I just believe that players like Kanavi, maybe even Cuz, are going to have some more bounce back moments across this split. And then we get to the solo laners. If there is a place where you can get, I don't know, concerned, it's maybe the solo laners. Vikla, maybe not so much. I mean, this guy moved up to #6 for me in the mid lane rankings. Again, I hate to remind people, some people might see that as disrespectful. That's best to the rest, man. Like, are you better than Showmaker and Zeka with the longevity that you have? Probably not. It's hard to break through that. Well, then I guess you're #6 in these rankings. #6 is not meant to be any sort of insult in terms of where Vikla is landing. This is a massive accomplishment, quite frankly, for a player with the resume that Vikla has had over the past couple of years, ever since he left the LCK in the first place. He was awesome at the beginning of the year. This guy was going toe-to-toe with Chovy in lane, being able to solo kill Faker and, put up some really big moments in that series against T1, be better than Showmaker in their matchup. It's really just about consistency. If Vikla does it for another split, then yeah, he's going to start to be considered amongst those upper echelon. The only thing that's holding Vikla out of top 5 conversation for me is just the fact that it's only been one split that he's been performing like this. So I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to keep it up. It's a good meta for him because it's very mage-oriented, very control mage oriented, which I think fits what Vikla wants to do. He's not exactly the most aggressive player. He can play assassins, but he prefers these more AP oriented, mid lane metas, and I think we're in that right now. And I think generally he plays well off of Raptor, doesn't need to be a main character, can focus more on the 1v1, which was always something he was pretty good at. Just kind of got his confidence back, which was always something that was missing with Vikla. And then Clear on the top side. Clear is a great example that, like, you really don't need a great top laner in this meta to be successful. I hate to kind of dog on Clear. I don't mean to. Like, people are going to point out, like, oh, at first stand, he was really good. Yeah, man, he was going up against Broken Blade. And, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's not like the top lane, the third best top laner at first stand might have been Clear or Xiaoshu, like, Broken Blade. Like, if that's the conversation for third best top laner, yeah, Clear's going to be able to do well in that circumstance. It's just different here in the LCK. He is a fine, like, a league average, maybe slightly below league average caliber top laner. It's going to do okay for himself in the 1v1, go neutral most of the time, especially because his team has so much tempo right now with how much teams need to invest into the bottom side in order to make sure Diablo and Kellen aren't killing them throughout a majority of the early game. Clear kind of gets more runway, more leeway to be able to operate in the early game, but mechanically, you know, he's fine. He's an average mechanical LCK top laner. He's, I would say, a below average decision maker, and he's really bad in losing matchups, but if you can get him into a comfort spot, he's not going to kill you. He's not going to lose you the game instantly. I think BLG could have done a bit better at capitalizing on him on the top side because Bin was doing a good job of beating him in the 1v1, but, you know, Clear as a liability is fine. And again, your top laner doesn't really matter unless they're like a big problem for your team, which Clear isn't. He's, you know, fine. Slightly below average, but maybe like a league average top laner, which this team can live with. They don't need top side to be the main focus. Bot lane is always going to be the main focus. If Vikla is still winning in the 1v1, if Raptor is continuing to skirmish and win, quite frankly, all the time in the mid game, getting these 1k gold leads on himself, and if Diablo is in a position where he can take over in the late game, he will take over in the late game. He's maybe the most consistent late game hyper carry in the entire world right now. I really like FearX. I don't quite like them for top 2. I think there is some natural regression coming in here. I wouldn't even really be surprised if they fell lower than this, but I want to give them a lot of credit for what they were able to accomplish, mostly because they beat both T1 and Dplus KIA in the playoffs, in the best of 5s. And so that has to count for something. You have to give them that level of acknowledgement. I just don't know if they're going to be top 2 again. That is such a big bar. I think that they do have their backs up against the wall to prove that they belong there again, but they have more than enough talent and certainly enough star power to be able to get there if they play well. But then moving on to number 2 in my power rankings, and the team that I think, I guess, will bounce back from a very weird playoff run for them, it's T1 coming in at number 2. This is actually a tier jump for me. I don't know how popular that's going to be with people. This is moving up to my A tier. I really do think T1 was really good over the course of the LCK Cup. They just kind of folded in the playoffs, and that's kind of T1-esque in terms of domestic playoffs. They're not always the most consistent team in terms of the best of 5s domestically. It's really only international tournaments that they find themselves being consistent in, but this is still a team that I think has more than enough juice and quite frankly had an awesome winter split. They just lost 2 best of 5s that they probably had no business losing, and I'm just expecting them to be able to turn that back around. I assume this is going to be a decently popular take, but I think T1 is kind of the favorite right now to be in that number 2 spot, and I'll talk about why. Their lineup is still looking like Doran in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Pays at AD carry, and KIA at support. Once again, you're looking at a team that has very clear strengths and I guess kind of less clear weaknesses, although they still have them. The ways that they ended up losing their series was losing control over the mid-jungle duo, which is by far the most important part of the map right now. When you're looking at the matchup against FearX in particular in the upper bracket, you're talking about Raptor just outplaying Owner. How consistent do you think that is? That's kind of up to you. Raptor was awesome in that playoff run. I don't know how, consistent it is for Raptor to be better than Owner. Like, I like Raptor a lot, and I think he can be around top 3 in terms of these jungle rankings, but Owner should bounce back from that. This was a guy I called my number 1 jungler in the LCK at the start of this year because I think he had proven it last year that the consistency was there. I think obviously that didn't necessarily show itself in the playoffs, and so I move him down to number 2, but Owner is still awesome. I think he was excellent throughout a majority of the regular season and really was stepping up. Ironically enough, it was him and Faker that I think were doing a lot of the heavy lifting to get this team undefeated. I know it says they finished 4th, and that is correct, but they came out of the regular season 5-0 in terms of their 4 best of 3s and 1 best of 5 that they ended up playing. They were just like Gen.G, although they lost a game, and so they didn't quite get that undefeated record, but they only went in as the 2 seed undefeated because they lost 1 game in a best of 3. Like, T1 were as advertised for a majority of that split. They just couldn't make it work in the playoffs, and I think Owner was, a reason why that needed to get better in the playoffs. Faker was another reason. I thought he was really underwhelming in that series against BFX, and you know what? It's Faker. Like, I just have to imagine that things are going to turn himself around. Like, Faker has never been the most dominant domestic player. It's been forever since Faker has really ever felt like he's been able to keep up with the best players in the LCK. Obviously, Worlds time is very different. He ends up unlocking and activating a new version of himself, but it's clear that he plays different domestically than he does internationally, and that could cause some concern about whether or not this team is going to qualify for MSI, but I do feel like he's very motivated to get himself to international tournaments, and he was really the biggest holdover. Like, Vikla being better than Faker was why they lost to BFX, and then in that series against Dplus KIA, he was really bad down the stretch against Showmaker and really the entirety of DK in that series. So I think Faker is going to be fine. Like, if you have faith in Faker, then you probably have faith that this team can get top 2, because that's basically the major thing that needed to change in order for T1 to be in a better spot. Doran goes up to number 2 in my ranking because Zeus was so bad on the top side. Doran is still exactly who we thought he was. He's like the ultimate version of a Shiwu or a Rich or a player like that, where his laning is going to be inconsistent. He's not always going to generate leads. He's much better in terms of his mechanics on the top side, and so if you do get him into this strong side matchup, which he almost never gets, he can do really well with that. That was something that went underrated and undervalued for Doran for a really long time when he was on Gen.G, is that ability to actually be played for as a primary threat on the top side of the map. I think he is still capable of doing that, but really what he is known for is being down 1,000 gold and being by far the most important player in team fights. It's actually insane how consistently that happens for him on T1. It's like that T1 magic is perfectly encapsulated in what Doran can do, because it does not matter what position in the game he's in. He just has this unique understanding of where he needs to be in the late game to cause the most amount of chaos and carnage. I still value Doran, not the most dominant player in the universe, but a lot of the top laners here, like I said, are very specialized in the way that they win. Doran is certainly no exception to that. And then you've got the bot lane here. Paze and KT certainly didn't see anything out of them that made me worry. KT continued to be very good at the beginning of the year. Maybe he could have been more aggressive as a playmaker. And, you know, in that series against DK, I think he had some moments in the back end against Career where you're like, oh, Career's at number 7, KT is at number 1. How is that possible? I just want to trust that every other game that KT played over the course of that split was more influential than the 3 that he ended up losing in the reverse sweep at the end there. It's obviously not ideal, but KT looked, you know, KT-esque for a majority of the LCK Cup. It's just about making sure he can maintain that with his playmaking instincts. And, you know, I think him and Paze had the chemistry we expected them to have. Paze is definitely different than Gumayushi in the way he operates, but he's better in lane than I think people give him credit for. And if they do want to play for a dominant 2v2, they've actually been decently successful at being able to generate those early leads if KT wants to play something more aggressive. I'm not saying that this is the bot lane to bring out like the Caitlyn Varus support kind of stuff, but I don't think that it's not that. Like, you can punish something like a Karma really hard if you do want to go super aggressive on the bottom side. Paze can play for the 2v2. And again, very similar to what we talked about with Diablo, he's just the kind of player that can take a game and snowball it incredibly quickly. He's much more comfortable on hyper carries, but we do know he is much more stable in the 2v2. It's, again, why he comes in one spot above Diablo, is I think he's just a little bit more versatile than Diablo is as a player, even if I think they're decently similar mechanically. Diablo might even be better mechanically. That's how good Diablo is, but Paze certainly has shown no problems for me. I think him and KT have not even unlocked like the full extent of what their bot lane 2v2 synergy can look like in terms of what you could expect out of them. I just think T1 are going to recover. I think this is, if you asked me right now, who is the team that I would bet on to be at MSI? Obviously, number 1 is number 1, and we'll talk about them. There's a lot of narrative and conversation surrounding number 1 right now, but who would be the other team to make MSI out of the LCK? Like, you have to make a pick now. I'm going with T1. I really do believe that it's hard to bet against what we saw for a majority of the LCK Cup just because they had two bad best of 5s. Now, worth noting, they didn't win a single playoff series. They lost both of their playoff series with the extra life, which is really not ideal. But again, like, I just think that there's some magic here, and quite frankly, I think this team is going to get better as they get more time to synergize together. T1 very rarely makes massive roster changes. I think Paze is a very different player than Gumayushi in terms of the way he comes in and integrates. We've seen T1 take some time to get at their biggest form. It's why they're always their best at Worlds, because it does take them some time to ramp up. I think that might be the case again this year, and I think my expectation is by the end of the spring split, we're going to be looking at one of the most dangerous teams in the world once again. But that's going to bring us to number 1 in my power rankings. And the team you knew was going to get number 1. They lost 2 games across the entirety of the LCK. It's Gen.G coming in at number 1. And boy, is there more conversation around this team than ever. After the first stand performance that they gave, they perform as expected in the group stage and then go to the semifinals only to get 3-0'd by G2. Like, I talked about it when I did my first stand analysis. I don't want to repeat myself too much when it comes to this. And so I'm doing this at the beginning of this overview before we talk about these players. But I don't know what to take away from that series because it was just so dominant, right? Like, they were so bad in every area. It's not like, oh, they made this and this mistake, and that's indicative of the fact that they're bad at this and this. They lost everywhere. Every lane lost. Their macro was behind. They were slower in tempo. I don't really have like an explanation for what needs to be fixed because everything kind of went wrong for the team. But again, it's Gen.G domestically. Like, how do you bet against Gen.G in the LCK? All they do is win this league. You can talk about internationals some other time because this is an LCK power ranking. So let's talk about it. I mean, their lineup is looking like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and Duro at support. Again, going top to support here, I think makes the most amount of sense in terms of, just going over everybody. Keen is having like the best start to a year he's maybe ever had. I think that's fair to say. This guy was so dominant. He was my pick for MVP of the LCK Cup in the winter split. I do think he was the best player in the LCK Cup. And, Keen's been the best top laner in the world for a bit. I don't think it's been so like overwhelming. He was my #1 top laner last year, and he still came in number 10 for me in my top 20 players in the world video, or top 20 players at Worlds video. Like, I just think top lane is one of those positions where it's really hard to be like, oh, you're all obviously better than all of these mid laners who have much more of an impact on the game. But Keen found a way to make that happen at the beginning of the year. Not only was he strong side, he was weak side, isolated, and dominating 1v1s in a way that we just had not seen from a lot of players in recent memory. I mean, he was unbelievably unstoppable, and the only negative you can give him is he somehow got run over by Broken Blade in the laning phase. Not even that was entirely true. He just kind of went neutral against Broken Blade drafting tanks, which is not really what you want to see on the top side, but I have no worries about Keen. Like, he is a player that I think is super stable, can do basically anything that you want, and he's in great form right now. If he plays anything like he did in the winter split, we're going to be talking about him as the potential best player in the world by the end of the year. So, happy to keep him as my #1 top laner. Canyon moves up a spot to my #1 top laner. He certainly proved a lot of the doubters wrong throughout a lot of the beginning part of this year. I was a big defender of Canyon last year. I thought he was getting way too much hate for a team that barely had any problems throughout a majority of the year. And while Canyon is decently specific in the way that he wins, like, name another jungler who's not specific in the way that they win, or not a little flippy. People always bring up, oh, Tarzan's better. Oh, Kanavi was better last year. Oh, Owner was better last year. And while I did like Owner more going into this year with the way that he played out Worlds last year, I think it's one of those things where it's like, all of these players have flaws. Like, we focus on Canyon's flaws, but every single jungler in the world has like notable flaws. The position is too hard to be perfect in. You're just not going to get that. Canyon generates so much offense and so much aggression for his team that he is the most valuable jungler in the world, even if he's not always going to have good games, and even if he is a bit more specific in terms of the way he drafts. I think this meta is phenomenal for Canyon, getting to play things like Vi and Xin Zhao and Jarvan every single game, being not only a facilitator, but someone who can skirmish a lot in the mid game. It's the perfect blend for Canyon, who loves to carry, doesn't like to facilitate, but also gives him the chance to get his laners involved. Obviously, still really like Canyon. Chovy in the mid lane, like, I don't really want to go too deep into this. Chovy was like the only player to even have any semblance of a laning phase against G2. It's not like he was winning. I think Caps was more than fine in that series, but like, I don't know, man. Chovy was unbelievable. He was Chovy throughout most of the LCK. He was certainly Chovy at first stand up until that G2 series. I really don't have a lot to talk about when it comes to him because I've said so much on him throughout this entire channel's lifespan. He can do everything. He's the best shove and row mid laner in the entire world. He's an awesome skirmisher. He's a fantastic team fighter. The only time he ever gets in massive deficits is when his team is losing and he plays side lanes a little bit too passively. And I mean, that's really the only time you can lend any criticism to Chovy. It's something he's cleaned up a lot over the past couple of years. People will throw criticism at him as if it's 2021, and obviously Chovy has grown a lot as a player, but people don't like to hear that. They want to imagine that he's still the same player that he was when, he was getting caught in side lanes and being super passive and not doing anything. He's obviously a very different player now than what he was then. He's the best player in the world. To me, it's just not particularly close. Knight and Keen, I think, are the two players that are the closest. I'd still put Chovy #1 on that list for myself. And then Ruler and Duro on the bottom side. Duro, unfortunately, the only player to not come in at #1, just like it was the case at the beginning of the year. Unfortunately, I just think Carry is better. I love Duro, and I think he's a really good player. I think he gets protected a lot by the fact that Gen.G are really good. I think he's oftentimes the second best player on this team in basically any given game, regardless of who the first best player on the team is. That can kind of rotate, but Duro is often the player that is facilitating them the most. He's really good in lane, really good playmaker, pretty good team fighter, super versatile, and then Ruler is Ruler. He's still going to make some missteps in terms of his positioning. He can still get caught out, but mid-game, Ruler is still the best mid-game AD carry in the history of League of Legends. That's not even really all that debatable. He's gotten even better in the 2v2 because Duro was so dominant in terms of being able to generate advantages, and he's a pretty decent, consistent late-game team fighter. He just gets over-eager right now. You can tell this guy is hunting for every pentakill that he could possibly get. You can even hear it on the calls, but he's starting to get in his own head about like, oh, I want to, rack up the KDAs as much as possible, and he certainly does rack up the KDAs. So for Gen.G, the only thing standing in their way is themselves. Like, it's certainly not a talent thing. They are better than every other team in the world from a talent perspective. Like, that is not debatable. From like pure mechanics perspective, like, there's nobody that can compete with Gen.G if they're not in their own head or in their own way. The only times this team runs into any problems is when they don't play up to their own standard. They just have to make sure that they keep consistent. But I mean, it's domestic Gen.G. How can you expect this team to do anything other than dominate? It's all they've done over the past couple of years. If anything, the more they struggle internationally, the more they dominate the LCK. You can talk about international rankings and what you expect from this team if they were to go to MSI. But for now, we are sitting at a spot where All they've done is dominate the LCK. They lost 2 games, 5 games across this year up until this point, and that's even with them getting swept. They're still in an incredibly dominant spot. They're still, in my opinion, by far the best team in the world until proven otherwise. And, you know, it's just going to be hard to imagine a world where Gen.G are not favorites going into the LCK, regardless of what happens at any international tournament. All right, but that is going to do it for my LCK Spring Split Primer and Power Rankings video. Thank you guys again for sticking around. These videos are always super long, so I really appreciate those of you who watch all the way through. I know there's a lot of people who kind of jump around in these videos as well, so if you're hearing this outro, you know, I appreciate however much you watched, and let me know what you agree or disagree with down in the comment section below. As I said before, I'm not afraid of sharing my opinion. I know that naturally sharing any opinion online is going to invite a lot of discourse, and, you know, I'm generally more than happy to kind of hear where I'm with the community and where I'm against the community. I'm not really scared of sharing my opinions, and I'm curious to know what you guys think is consensus, what you guys think is super out there and super weird in terms of my takes. So let me know what you agree with, what you like, what you don't like down in the comments section below. But that transitions us nicely into talking about the rest of the year. We are covering every single LCK game, as we always do on this channel, week over week. So if you're interested in that, hit the subscribe button. But we also cover 3 other major regions as well: the LCS, the LEC, and the LPL. We, of course, are starting our coverage of the NACL Tier 2 over in North America. That video for week 1 is coming out tomorrow after we already posted that primer, so very excited to get into coverage for that as well. And I'm still a caster for LPL English, and I know that's so much being thrown at you, but if you're interested in watching me cast live or just want to get caught up on the LPL, the region that, at least as of right now, has to be considered the big region, coming off of their first big international tournament win in a very long time, go ahead and check out the links in the description to LPL English. I'll be a color caster for them throughout the rest of the year. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all